All right, so now we're going to talk about the objections to the evidential problem of evil. So, although you probably don't need reminding this quickly, let's go through it one more time. This argument is really just playing on the idea that there are pointless evils in the world, and God can't allow pointless evils, so probably God doesn't exist. Their examples of pointless evils come from the suffering fawn case or the evils occurring to children. Now, those who want to defend the idea that God exists have to question either the first or second premise. Right? The defender of the existence of God will have to say either, well, the atheist is wrong, and there really are no pointless evils in the world. So even the fawn case and the suffering children cases, there's a point to those, right? They're not pointless. They have to be there. God has to allow them to somehow secure the greater good, and they'll tell different stories about what that might be. Or they'll say, well, we can't know either way. So they'll either say premise one is false, or we don't know whether or not premise one is true or false. Right? So really all of the responses will directly engage here with premise one, or the idea that there are pointless evils. So let's look at one of those responses. The first response is often called a theodicy. So what's happening here is they're questioning premise one and saying premise one is false. It's not the case that there are pointless evils. Every evil has some point to it. So people who appeal to theodicies are making the claim that premise one is false, there are no pointless evils, and we can think of perfectly good reasons a God might have for allowing such evils into the world. So there are going to be perfectly good reasons for the God to allow the suffering fawn case or the child case, right? And now notice, we're only going to look at one particular theodicy, but there are hundreds of different ones you could try out. Right? So theodicies will all try and fill God's reasons in, and there are multiple different ways you could do that. So we're just going to look at one here. So here's a possible theodicy. An important role for humans to fulfill is to develop morally and spiritually. So what does that mean? Well, it means that it's very important for us as humans that we develop into better moral beings and somehow prepare our spirit for the afterlife, for heaven, right? And so part of what we're doing here on earth is just developing into better moral and spiritual beings. And so then the rest of the theodicy goes as follows. So it's important for us to fulfill and develop morally and spiritually. And if we lived in a world without evil, then it seems we couldn't have any worthwhile moral or spiritual development. So thus, God allows evil so that we can further develop as moral beings. Thus, no evil is pointless. All of the evil exists to further our development. So let's think of our previous two cases. Does the theodicy explain these away? Well, the evils occurring to children, it seems like it might. So the person who's using this theodicy will say, look, we can develop morally and spiritually by seeing suffering occurring to each other as adults. But what really tugs on your heartstrings, right? When we see people getting shot in the streets or murdered by spouses, so on and so forth, we always think it's sad and it's a tragedy, and we always are sort of affected by it. But now think of how much more people are affected by seeing those same types of stories occurring to children, right? So when we see that a man broke into a house and shot another man, we're like, okay, that's bad, that's tragic, it makes us sad. But if somebody broke into a house and then shot all the children in the house, we would be outraged, right? We'd be beyond just sort of we wouldn't just think it's bad, we'd be outraged and sad to a level that we aren't normally outraged or sad when just a regular murder occurs, right? So the theodicist will be saying roughly that sure, we can develop morally and spiritually without allowing evils to occur to children, but not as far and not as great as we could if we could see these evils occurring to children. So the best way for us to develop morally and spiritually is to see evils occurring not just to those who we see as equals, but to those who are innocent and incapable of defending themselves. Right? And so children play this special role. When we see suffering occurring against children or to children, we develop even more. We develop faster and a greater capacity morally and spiritually. At least that's what the person who believes in a theodicy is going to say. So there is a point, right? There is a point for evils occurring to children. They better our development as moral beings. What about the case of the fawn? Well, it's not as clear that that helps us develop morally and spiritually, so they might have to depend on some different type of theodicy to explain the case of the fawn. But, I mean, you could understand how this might work, right? So, God allows the suffering of animals in nature, even when we can't see it, because it allows for us to develop morally and spiritually just by knowing there's this suffering out there. That's not as convincing as their explanation regarding evils occurring to children, but it's the type of explanation they could give. Now, notice, we're only dealing, like I said, with one particular theodicy. There are thousands of different things you could try out for a theodicy. And maybe they'll be able to use our theodicy about moral and spiritual development to explain away the evils occurring to children, telling us why there's a point to that, and then have to use a completely different theodicy to explain away the suffering of the fawn. And that's perfectly okay, right? You don't have to use just one theodicy. You could use a number of different theodicies to show why each instance of what we thought was pointless evil really has a point to it. Okay, so that's our rough idea about why theodicies, our particular theodicy, could explain away both. Now, does this theodicy actually work? Well, like I said, in the fawn case, it doesn't seem to work that well. If we're trying to talk about our moral and spiritual development, well, then somehow we have to actually be affected, right? So when the fawn suffered in the forest, we, as part of our story, we said the fawn doesn't actually the suffering of the fawn is never seen by anybody. It just happens sort of behind closed doors in nature, right? So if every animal that suffered was somehow seen by a person, then it would make sense that that helps us develop spiritually and morally. By seeing innocent animals suffering, we become better people because we get a better sense of right and wrong, and we start to feel remorse and sadness at bad actions, right? But since no one ever sees the fawn suffering, it doesn't help anybody develop spiritually and morally. So the fawn example, at least this particular theodicy, doesn't seem to work for the fawn example. So maybe they have to come up with another theodicy. What's more interesting, though, is that it doesn't even seem like this theodicy really works for the child case. So it might, but I think probably not. Right? So they have a good story to tell. The suffering of children will impact us in a way that the suffering of adults just doesn't. And so that will help us develop spiritually and morally. But now think about the sheer number of child harm cases in the world. Right? There are children everywhere who are suffering, and it doesn't seem like we need this sheer number, right? So let's just imagine, let's just stipulate that there are 1,000,001 cases right now of children being harmed. Wouldn't we all develop spiritually and morally just the same if there were only 1,000,000? Right? If that one extra child didn't have to suffer, it seems like we would all still develop morally and spiritually in the same exact way, whether there were 1,000,000 suffering children or 1,000,001 suffering children. So if there are 1,000,001 instead of 1,000,000, that means there's one case of pointless evil, right? There's a child out there suffering who doesn't have to in order for us to develop the same way. And I'm guessing that the number is actually quite different, right? So just say that there were 1,000,000 cases of child harm in the world. It seems like we would develop just as well if there were only, say, 500,000 cases. So there would really be a lot of pointless cases of children suffering. And it's unfortunate that some children would have to suffer to help us develop spiritually and morally, but clearly not all of these children do. So there are at least some pointless evils. So it seems like even this theodicy can't give a point to every case of child suffering. And so that means there will be some pointless cases, which means there are some pointless evils. And then the evidential argument from evil works, right? We shouldn't believe in the existence of God because there's this pointless evil. But like I said, they might be able to depend on a different theodicy at this point. It's not clear, but we're not going to run through dozens of theodicies here. Just notice that's the general way it works, right? The atheist says, here are some pointless evils. The theodicist says, no, there's really a point to these evils. And then the atheist can either respond, well, I see what you're saying, but there's still going to be pointless evils, or your theodicy just fails from the get-go and there are still pointless evils. And then they can go back and forth like that. So that's how a theodicy response would work. But at least this is one of the most popular theodicies, the one we've been talking about, and it really doesn't seem to explain away either of our cases of pointless evil. Also imagine, I don't want to get too deep into this, but we mentioned earlier that maybe God could cut the fawn's suffering by 1 second. Or you could have a child case who's being burned 30 times by a cigarette, but now God could make it so that he was just burned 29 times. And so it seems in both of those cases, God is allowing some pointless evil, right? It could just be the 1 extra second the fawn is suffering, or the 1 extra burn the child suffers. Seems like we would develop morally and spiritually the same, even if they just took 1 second of suffering away. And so that 1 second of suffering could also be seen as a pointless evil. Okay, so now let's move on to the second type of objection, skeptical theism. And we don't have to spend much time on this guy. So skeptical theists just say, look, the human mind is super limited. There are great limitations to what the human mind can do. And the reason why we're baffled by these cases like the fawn and the children is that we simply just can't know enough to understand God's justification. Right? So in other words, they're saying, God has a point, and it's just beyond our ken. We can't know it. Right? So God might know if he eliminated even 1 minute, 1 second of the fawn's suffering, that they would then somehow have to permit some other equally evil or even worse act, right? Or give up some greater good. So roughly what they're saying is, it seems like the fawn's suffering is pointless to us. But look, God is this omniscient being. He knows so much more than we could ever know. So even though it seems pointless to us, it wouldn't be pointless to God. God could see that maybe 1 second of the fawn's suffering, if he eliminated that, then 1,000,000 other people would suffer. And even though we can't draw those connections, that doesn't mean God can't. Right? And so the skeptical theist is saying, look, we shouldn't believe in premise 1, whether it's true or false, because we just can't have the type of evidence. We'd have to get somehow into God's mind to see whether there was a point or not, and we just can't do that. Now, notice this isn't, there's not a lot of room for debate here, right? The skeptical theist is just saying, sorry, we're limited, and there's nothing we can do about it. And the atheist is going to have to say, well, I think you're wrong. We aren't limited in that way, but there's no real way to settle the debate here, right? With the theodicy, you could say, hey, your theodicy works or doesn't. Okay, it doesn't, try another one, and you can keep debating. The skeptical theist is essentially saying, sorry, we can't even debate about this. It's beyond our knowledge. So you might disagree with that, you might not, but those are the two major responses to the evidential problem of evil. Hopefully you now have some beliefs about whether or not the argument works. Thanks, everyone.